Good morning. I'm Barbara Lohman, Coastside Land Trust Board President, welcoming you to our free community webinar series. Coastside Land Trust is dedicated to preserve and steward our open space for current and future generations. As a nonprofit organization, we work to safeguard our scenic bluffs, stream corridors, and agricultural lands from the southern city limits of Half Moon Bay north through the community of Montara. We protect land by purchasing or accepting donations of land and conservation easements. We secure private and public funding for land conservation. We provide assistance and resources to landowners interested in protecting their land. We lead local conservation, restoration, stewardship, and educational activities. As members of our community and valued Coastside Land Trust supporters, we ask you to make choices that support our organization and our important work. This can be done by donating through our website, or other easy ways to donate are through planned giving of assets and land through wills and living trusts, vehicle donations, gifts of stock, or tribute gifts, and also gifts of time by participating in our work days. We all need to do whatever we can to protect and steward our open space. Thank you for joining us today. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Kate Dickey, our social media coordinator, to introduce our presenter. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Barbara. And thank you all for joining us here for this free community webinar series. Our hope here is that this series will allow you and all of us to learn from a breadth of esteemed and relevant environmental vantage points, each geared towards educating us about the living world and our connection to it, so that we can know more, make better choices for caring for the environment on a local and global level. Today, I'm really excited to introduce you to Dr. Sheena Sidhu. Sheena is an ecologist focused on conservation and stewardship. Presently, she's working as a stewardship scientist at Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve, which is a research field station of Stanford University. She's implementing land management practices for wildfire resiliency and watershed restoration and studying their short and long-term environmental impacts. Prior to this work, though, she also worked with the San Mateo Resource Conservation District, San Mateo RCD, and the San Mateo Department of Agriculture while living in El Granada. So she's very familiar and very fond of the coastside and the community here too. And she spends much of her time here on this side of the hill. She earned her doctorate degree with Penn State University in entomology, studying bee communities on small farms. And then she did her postdoc research at UC Riverside, where she studied native bees and rare pollination on the Channel Islands. She's been living on the peninsula now for about 10 years, and she loves finding pockets of people to share her loves of bees. So we are her pocket today. Today, Dr. Sidhu is going to lead us all on a talk of the humble bumblebee, as she calls it, and its connection to Half Moon Bay Coast and our pumpkins. So just quickly before we begin, just a couple of ground rules. Please make sure that when you have questions, just type them into the Q&A section. We'll do a formal Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So let's just allow her to give her presentation, and then we can ask all sorts of questions. But hopefully have some, because this is a great opportunity to ask someone who knows a whole lot. We hope you enjoy this presentation and it helps you to gain a greater awareness. Just remember though, too, that if you are able to, whether it's today or during your time of giving, that this program, as well as many other Coastside Land Trust programs, all of our programs are run by donation and grant funding. So every donation makes a huge impact in allowing us to do this, to bring this awareness and education to our community, and also for us to be doing the work, this important land, both preservation and restoration and stewardship of our land. So I'm going to turn it right over to Dr. Sidhu. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Sidhu.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Barbara. Thanks to the Coastside Land Trust for having me. I am so excited to share my fondness of bees with you. So I'm going to start sharing my presentation and we'll just jump right into it. Okay. Oops. Let's get this bigger for everybody. Okay, here we go. So we're going to be talking about the humble bumblebee. So I like calling it the humble bumblebee because often when we're talking about bees. People think about honeybees. I know that there's lots of folks that start thinking about native bees as well, but really this bumblebee that's just kind of in the middle of everything does so much work for us. In old time England, folks used to call it the humble bee. So humble bumblebee is where we got our name, humble bumblebee. So I'll talk a little bit. Kate did a great introduction of me. Thank you. I'll share a little bit more about myself, and then we'll just jump in to the talk. So a little bit about me. Yes, I'm an entomologist by my training. I received my degree from Penn State University. At Penn State, I studied agricultural sciences and conservation, and I did the whole spectrum of insect studies, looking at IPM, integrated pest management, looking at all the different types of bugs, but ultimately I had a fondness for native bees. And I focused on the study of plant-pollinator interactions, bee identification, and overall ecology about how things interact with each other. So these are two pictures of me, my younger self, studying and collecting insects to identify. And then in the middle, there's the image of me, of my bees. So I collected about 6,000 bees over my studies, and then I continue to do that for scientific purposes, pinning them and identifying them. Now I am continuing to focus on land stewardship, public engagement, opportunities like this I love. So thank you again for having me. And then youth development, particularly focusing on STEM education, is very important to me. So I wanted to talk about bees in general to set the stage. I know that we have folks from a spectrum of knowledge about bees that are at this talk. I'm assuming that you are all coming here because you have a fondness for nature and the environment and the coastside. And I'm also going to assume that we understand that bees are important to our ecosystems for agriculture and native plants as well, and that there's this plant-pollinator interaction and the value of bees. So we'll start with that assumption, but then let's dive into a little bit for folks that just might be new to this world of bees, and dig into a little bit of why we're focusing on the humble bumblebee today. So we'll start over on the side with honeybees. So honeybees, Apis mellifera. It's a single species of bees that are now almost all around the world, originally from Europe. They're introduced, and they are eusocial. So what does that mean? So they live in colonies, as you might be familiar with, and they talk to each other and they function as a superorganism. So there's a queen that's a reproductive, her workers, and they're going out and foraging, and they are generalists. They are not that picky about what kind of plants that they're going to pollinate, to collect resources for themselves. And they are perennial nest. So when you think about honeybees, you're thinking about these large thousands, up to 100,000s of bees in these large nests, because what they do is they persist through the season, through the summer and the fall, and then in the winter, they do some form of hibernation based on how cold it is in whatever part of the world they're in, and then they'll reemerge and start again in the springtime. And so because they can persist for multiple years in these perennial nests, they can get quite large. And because they don't have to restart every year, they have a long pollination period starting early in the season and extending late into the fall. However, if we're thinking about it on a daily scale, they actually have a short pollination period. They're kind of like me, where they like the nice warm days. They prefer to be out on the nice warm days. When it's cold and drizzly, you'll see fewer, if not any, honeybees out and about. So they like to just be out when it's nice and warm, collecting pollen and nectar. If we move to the other side with native bees, they are solitary, and they often are, so they're not in these nests. So often it's that mother, or you can call her a queen, but she's the mother bee, and she's making a single nest. She's collecting nectar and pollen, collecting the pollen and nectar, making a ball, laying an egg on it in her little nest, typically underground. And then she's out for just a few weeks, and her babies will emerge as larvae, then as pupa, and stay underground until they receive a cue in the spring and emerge. So they're on an annual cycle. So they're the same adult is not living through the season typically. Again, there's lots of different bees. There's 20,000 bee species in this world. So there are a few exceptions, but generally that's the case. Some of them are specialists where they only like a specific species of plants or subspecies, or they can be generalists where they're not picky about what plants they're going to. And they have that shorter pollination period where the adult is only out for a few weeks, depending on what kind of species it is. And similar to honeybees, they have that shorter pollination period as too. They prefer when it's nice and warm out and it's conducive to their to going out and being out and about. Okay, so we have honeybees, native bees. Bumblebees are a type of native bee, but I'm putting them in this middle of this Venn diagram to put them in context of the honeybee to native bee, eusocial to solitary spectrum. So these bees are social, but they're not quite eusocial and considered a superorganism the way that honeybees are. Like honeybees, they are generalists. They're not picky about what they really go to. But like native bees, they're on an annual nest cycle. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. But they are going from a queen bee. She's making a nest. She's going through the season, and the nest will die at the end of the season, and a new nest will restart. What makes them so wonderful is they have a long pollination period. So they start pretty early and extend late into the season. And on a daily level, they also have a long pollination period. Why is that? We have some clues right here looking at these images of these different bees. They're more robust, more furry. They can withstand different temperature fluctuations, and they're just overall more hardy bees. So they do a lot of work in our ecosystems. So in this talk today, we're going to be talking about a little bit about bumblebee natural history. Bumblebees as pumpkin pollinators. It is pumpkin season, so I thought it'd be great to talk about the relationship of bumblebees and pumpkins. We'll talk a little bit about coastside bumblebees and the status of bees in California, and end it with a quick bumblebee identification to whet your appetite and also give you some resources so you can continue that on your own. Okay, so the annual cycle of bumblebee colonies. So as we were talking about, bumblebee colonies are on an annual cycle. So let's start at number 1 on this image over here, where we're looking at the queen bee. She has been mated and she is underground, and she is waiting for some environmental cues to emerge. And so she's often much larger, robust, she has a lot of fat body as she's waiting underground for a cue. When the cue happens in the spring, temperature, moisture, etc., cues her, she will emerge. And she is much larger, and she goes out and starts all of the work on her own. She'll find an underground burrow. If you look at this image here, sometimes it's an old rodent burrow or some other kind of cavity, often underground. She'll start collecting nectar and pollen, making little wax cups, and collecting nectar, pollen, and also laying some daughters. Early in the season, her first cohort of daughters will emerge. And after that, she retires from work outside the nest, and she stays inside and continues to lay eggs and manage the colony and lay new cohorts of daughters while they continue to go out and be workers. Now, if we move on to number 4, near the end of the season, the queen bee, bumblebee, will start to lay drones, which are males, versus all her daughters are workers, females. So she'll lay some males and also some future queens that have like the larger fat bodies and are a little bit more robust. All the drones and the potential new queens will go out. Hopefully all the colonies will mix and mate, and a mated queen will go back into the cycle, and we'll start back at number 1. And the rest of the colony will die out in the season, and that's the end of this annual cycle for that particular colony. If you're a gardener and you're out in your garden early in the spring, you might disturb a queen bee. It's quite common actually for gardeners when they're out tilling the soil or preparing their garden bed that you might wake up a hibernating bee. And how will you know that she's the queen bee? She's quite large. Often it surprises folks how large they are. So on this image here, you can see the queen bee is quite a bit larger than the worker bee. And then male bees, I feel like they're a bit more like disheveled. They look a little bit, their hair is a bit more messy. On a quick glance, you might not be able to tell the difference between a drone bee and a worker bee, but they're about the same size, but I think they're just a bit more messier. Their only job is to mate. And then here's a look inside of a real colony. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing those wax cups that have some nectar stored in it. The queen's in the middle, and her workers are busy. And then these cups are closed, and that is where the queen has laid an egg. The larvae have been fed pollen, and then they're capped. And they pupate, so they're going through the full metamorphosis, and they will emerge as workers, and the colony will continue to grow. Depending on the species, colonies have between 50 and 200 plus, maybe even 1,000 with some particular species of bumblebees. That's how big their colonies get. But again, they end at the end of the season. And just a quick image of a newly emerged worker, because I think that's kind of interesting. Usually they have this silvery gray hair, very soft, but it's likely you'll see a newly emerged worker. They usually, they're only in the colony, and they'll become more robust, and their color will come before they emerge. So again, why are bumblebees so great? Hopefully I've already given you some clues about that, but here you can see on the images, they're generalists. They go to lots of different flowers. And again, I'm going on the assumption everybody here knows about that, the mutual relationship that many flowers and bees have, where their flowers are getting pollinated by the bees transferring pollen. And then the bees are getting nectar and pollen from the flower for themselves and to feed their colony. And so if you're out and about looking at bees, you might see these like orange packets, orangish yellow packets on bees. It's in honeybees, sorry, in bumblebees, which are quite large. They're quite obvious in some honeybees as well. And so what are these? These are called pollen baskets. So insects have 6 legs, each in pairs, and the last pair at the towards their abdomen has these pollen baskets. So there's combs and hairs that are cupped and shaped in a way that the bees, if they're full of pollen, can groom themselves and collect and pack that pollen into their legs, which they can then bring into the nest. So that's one way that they're very good and efficient of moving around pollen, because they do end up leaving some pollen on their bodies, which then as they travel to different flowers and are able to go to a lot of flowers in their long period of pollinating and visiting it per day, they can really transfer a lot of pollen. And bumblebee hair is not like human hair, where it's just like a single strand, but it's actually branched, and it has a lot of branches that really attract and trap a lot of pollen. So that is another reason why they're really efficient and really great pollinators. So they can attract a lot of pollen on their quite large hairy bodies. So with that knowledge, that basic knowledge we have of bumblebees, I wanted to talk about pumpkin pollination. So it's pumpkin season. I thought it'd be fun to celebrate the pollinators that bring us pumpkins. So this is some of the work that I did as a student at Penn State University. I wanted to study pollination in agricultural systems. And the particular reason I chose pumpkins and cucurbits, so squash and gourds, and also the related cucumis, which are cucumbers, similarly to watermelons. In that family of cucurbits, why I wanted to study that was because those kind of crops need 100% pollination in order to produce fruit. So this is compared to perhaps if you have eaten or seen a strawberry that's kind of warped and doesn't look symmetrical all around. That's because it has not received full pollination. It has not received all the possible pollen to its flower before it produces, but it can still turn into like a deformed fruit. Pumpkins and the related cucurbits are not like that. They must receive 100% or near 100%, 97% pollination in order to become a fruit, or else it aborts. So for that reason, it's a really neat study system to really look at pollination, the effectiveness of pollination. And so what we're looking at here is pumpkin. Here's a pumpkin flower, and they're quite large. So like if I put my hands together like this, it can be actually quite large. And if you're a gardener and you grow pumpkins, you will see that they have male and female flowers, including that the female flowers are noticeable because they actually have mini fruits at the base of them, which then enlarge once they become pollinated. So this is actually a squash, not a pumpkin, but then you'll have full pollination. Okay, oops. So here I focus on Pennsylvania bees. I was studying, I was a student at in Pennsylvania, and in a Pennsylvania pumpkin patch, and often around here too, there's three main pollinators. So you'll see honeybees, the smaller honeybees, squash bees, which are about the same size as honeybees, and bumblebees. So squash bees are a native bee, that's a solitary bee, and then bumblebees that we've talked about with that they have a social larger nest, and then honeybees. So at the time I started studying pumpkin pollination was just around the time when colony collapse disorder really hit the news. So you might be familiar with that. You've heard about that, the decline in honeybees. And over the years, we've realized that the decline is actually all different bee species. But this is when there was a little bit of a panic about honeybees. And many farmers rely on honeybees to pollinate their crops. And you may have heard about how bees get shipped across the country to do almond pollination or like blueberry pollination, etc. But in this case, farmers would rent honeybee hives and flood their pumpkin fields to ensure that they had 100% pumpkin pollination. And with colony collapse disorder, this is becoming more and more expensive to do. So what we wanted to study was there a way where these native bees, bumblebees and squash bees, could provide these free pollination services? So we decided to focus on bumblebees. I did a little bit of study on squash bees, but today I'll be talking about what we did with bumblebees. So why did we choose this? Let me see, this will work like this. Okay. So why did we choose this? So bumblebees are very efficient pollinators. So there was a study that a lot of my work was based on by Arndt and Nolt in 2011, where they looked at the number of pollen grains that were deposited per different type of bee onto a pumpkin flower. So this was just a single individual and how many pollen grains they deposit. So on the y-axis, we see the number of pollen grains deposited per visit by an individual. And honeybees do deposit between 50 and 100 pollen grains per visit, but bumblebees deposit twice as much as Apis mellifera, bombus, and patience bumblebee. That's common, eastern common bumblebee. And then squash bees as well. But if you take a step back, you'll know that honeybees have much larger colonies. So even though an individual deposits less, there's many bees out there. So that's why farmers use them, is because you can just load up your field with honeybees and they'll do a lot of pollination. But let's say you take honeybees out of the equation. Can bumblebees, and perhaps squash bees, but can bumblebees fill in that gap? They are way more efficient at depositing pollen per visit. And bumblebees, like honeybees, are in colonies, not quite as large, but there's a lot of them. Versus squash bees are individual solitary bees. And so perhaps it's that bumblebees that can fill in that critical role. So what I wanted to know was how many bees pollinate a pumpkin patch. So I could go out there and count how many bees there were in a pumpkin patch. That could be one way to do it. But that's actually not quite the right question to ask, because perhaps it's one colony that has like 100 individuals that's all saturated a field and is pollinating, but something happens to that nest. Perhaps a predator goes into the cavity and disrupts it. A farmer accidentally hits when they're mowing, hits the colony. Something could happen to that particular nest, and then you're out of pollinators. So what we actually want to know, this way, there we go, is how many colonies pollinate a pumpkin patch. So what, I went out to Pennsylvania, talked to a lot of farmers, and we were talking about what's the solution. If there are a high number of nests in the area, they all contribute some number of workers to a field. And if we have higher densities of nests, that are wild bees, wild bumblebees living in the surrounding landscape, and they're providing a few workers to the field, and we have a lot of colonies in the area. That's a very robust and resilient system where these wild bumblebees can provide the pollination services, and the farmers will not have to rely on honeybees. So that was our question, was how many colonies pollinate pumpkin patches? So I went out to about 16 farms around the state to collect bees. And so this is a, image of Pennsylvania, and you can see the landscape and the topography with the mountains in between. So because of the mountains in the agricultural part of the state, the farms are actually quite small, and most farmers are diversified farmers. So there's some squash and pumpkin growing next to buckwheat, growing next to other crops, next to grass, next to a fallow field, forested, different topography as the hills are sloping. So the landscape varies a lot. And what I was making a guess is that different landscapes might support more or less number of colonies. And so what I did was I took aerial photos of each of the farm sites and categorized the different landscapes. And what I was hoping is that we could make some sort of correlation, that there's more colonies observed on some pumpkin fields when there's more forest edge, for example, or perhaps there's more when there's more fallow field. Perhaps there's fewer colonies when there's more development, right? So that's the ultimate question of the study. So how did I determine the number of colonies, not necessarily the bees, per pumpkin field? So pumpkin patch. So again, we have our colony. And as I was telling you, there's a main queen and she has daughters, and the daughters are sisters. So if we collected the bees and determined how many sisters there were, we could then extrapolate how many colonies are represented in a field. So if we get so I collected about 200 plus bees per field, and then genetically sequenced them to find markers where I could then group families. I could group groups of sisters together and then determine how many families and nests and colonies were represented in a field. So I collected the bees in these little vials, and then what I did was snip a leg from each bee and took that back to the lab to genetically identify the bees. And so I know some people might cringe when I tell them I snipped a little leg off the bee, but I do think this was the best method to use. What we were doing was, instead of destructive sampling, which some other studies do, where they take the whole bee and just sacrifice the whole bee, I took the bee in the vial, placed her on ice, and when she kind of cooled down a little bit and it was a little bit slower, I snipped her leg, but then released her. And so we use this method because, insects actually get beat up quite a lot when they're out in the environment. Sometimes they lose a wing, a leg, an antenna. So taking one leg was not that different than maybe some normal instances of them losing a limb, which might happen. Also, I was focused on that middle leg, not the leg that has their pollen basket in the comb. And then also to remember that the worker bee is not the reproductive of the colony, right? That's the queen. So I'm not affecting overall health and reproductive health of the colony. So for those reasons, I did clip a leg. And when I was first studying this many years ago, it was sometimes hard to explain exactly what I was doing, but as I was thinking about how to explain it to you today, I was like, basically, I used 23andMe, a version of 23andMe, to figure out which bees were related from the ones I collected. So from that, we found out that over 100 bumblebee nests contributed to pollinating pumpkins and pumpkin patches around Pennsylvania. So we collected the bees, figured out how many nests were represented, how many groups of sisters were represented in the bees I collected. And then, because bees are central place foragers, meaning they have a nest, they go out and collect resources and come back, they are central placed foragers. So there's only a limited amount of area where they will go, right? They're not just traveling through the landscape. They're always coming back home. So I used the number of colonies that were represented, extrapolated that based on what's the potential foraging range of bees. And the literature was showing most bees forage about an average of 1/2 kilometer, 500 meters. And then we extrapolated that for an average nest density of 161 colonies represented in these pumpkin patches. And just in case we developed a range too, in case you consider that they might go 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers. But ultimately, this is consistent with the literature of how typically far bees travel. So that is a lot of colonies helping to pollinate a field. And from that, we talked to farmers and said, hey, this looks like you have a pretty robust and resilient system where these bumblebees can pollinate your crops for you. We try to connect that to different land types and say perhaps like if a farmer had more forests or something that forest edges that maybe there's more colonies, but we didn't see any strong connection. And I think that's because these fields and these farms are very diverse. There's just a lot of potential habitat for these bees. So it's just a really healthy system. So that brings up a question probably about what about bees on the coast side? So here are 2 images of pumpkin patches, of a pumpkin patch that's near Half Moon Bay, and how many bee colonies help to pollinate these pumpkins. One thing to consider is there's similar patch sizes to the studies that I did in Pennsylvania. These are like smaller farms, and there's lots of different types of landscape around. However, there's an ocean bordering many of our coastside pumpkin patches. So that changes the density, how the density might be distributed among the nests in the landscape. It could have, the bees are not going to be nesting or foraging in the ocean. There are some similarities in the landscape with the hills and the diversity and the forests and the forest edges. However, it's very different vegetation types of the plants that we have around here. So all that being said, we don't know how many colonies are helping to pollinate our pumpkins in the coast side, but this would be definitely worth exploring. Okay, so the last major thing I wanted to talk about was the status of the humble bumblebee. So there are about 20,000 different bee species in the world, 4,000 native bees in different native bee species in North America, and about 1/4 of all North American bees are facing some level of threat, including extinction. And so of our humble bumblebee, there's a group from the International Union of the Conservation of Nature that creates a red list every few years to look at the status of bees, and particularly bumblebees. And if you look at this bottom of it, if they're of least concern and they're very abundant and robust in the ecosystems, extending all the way to vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, and even extinct. And many of these bee species are facing threats from habitat loss, exotic plants, pesticides, diseases, with pesticides and diseases also being major causes of declines in honeybees as well, especially in agricultural systems, and also bees spread diseases to each other as well. And so with all of these contribute to some of the losses of bees. So I wanted to talk just about a few species of West Coast bees that are particularly vulnerable, and that's worth knowing about. So Bombus crotchii, Crotch's bumblebee, used to be so abundant in the Central Valley of California, very, very abundant. And now its range has shrunk so much, and it is listed as endangered. So this is one of the ones that has definitely been impacted by habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, and just in a few decades from it to go to being very abundant in the Central Valley to pretty much non-existent in the Central Valley has been very stark. And this has been something that bumblebee researchers have tracked. So this is one to be on the lookout for if you did come across it. And bumblebee researchers are really looking at what the emerging status of this one is. Bombus franklini, the Franklin's bumblebee. This one is critically endangered. This is even further on the spectrum of the red list and the vulnerability of this bee. This one only exists in the southern part of Oregon and the northern part of California. And so it already had a very small range and is becoming even smaller. Again, habitat fragmentation and other impacts are really shrinking this. So this one's critically endangered. The bumblebee community is really concerned about this one as well. So it's these impacts that are from just land use, habitat, and threats, again, from diseases. What happens is that sometimes these bees mix with bees that have been exposed to agriculture with other diseases, and it does spread into the wild community. Bombus occidentalis is a western bumblebee. So this one is vulnerable. It used to have a very, very, very extensive range, even going down into Arizona and New Mexico, all the way up to Alaska. And this one has also become very rare to see. We used to have it around in our area. It's quite hard to find now. But this is the one that in California, it's being reviewed for a species of concern, and at the federal level, this is being reviewed to also review. There's a literature review happening right now by scientists that are reviewing the status of this bee. A lot of bumblebee researchers are spending a lot of time on trying to elevate the status of this bee because it's of a concern. To the point too that many of my colleagues and fellow land managers are already implementing some practices to help to preserve this habitat of this bee, the western bumblebee, which again used to be so prolific and has really declined quite quickly in just a few decades. Okay, so I wanted to wrap this up by talking about bee identification. So I think bumblebees are a great gateway into insect identification. There's a lot of birders out there, a lot of botanists out there, so I want there to be more entomologists out there when you're hiking and you can identify a bee. And it can be a little tricky, especially if you're very new to this world. So when I was developing this presentation and I was looking for a generic clip art of a bee, now they have these 3D animated bees. So I typed in bee and I was like, what's going to show up? And this showed up. What is this? Perhaps it's a bee. It has that stereotypical yellow and black. It has those pollen baskets that I'm seeing, but it has just 2 wings, which is what flies have. And it's maybe hairy, maybe not, like a wasp or a bee. So, when the average person is going around and looking at this bright yellow, black thing flying around, what is it? So I wanted to just help guide us on what it is that you're seeing when you're out there. So we'll talk about Hymenoptera and their cousins. So Hymenoptera are ants, bees, wasps, and how they're all related. They're all known for their skinny waist, Hymenoptera. We'll talk about aposematic coloring, which is the warning coloring, right? That is what that black and yellow is. It's a warning color to predators that don't bother me. We'll talk about Mullerian mimicry. Mullerian mimicry is honest mimicry. So that's saying I'm using this type of warning color because I can sting you, and so can the bee, so can the wasp. We can all sting you. We're all dangerous. We're trying to use a general language to predators. Don't bother me. But then there's Batesian mimicry, which is you can consider a dishonest mimicry. So that's an insect saying hey, those stinging bees and wasps over there, I'm going to look like them so that I can also warn predators I'm dangerous. Okay. So that's what we have here. So we're going to talk a little bit about these concepts in the context of identifying bumblebees. And from there, you'll have some more knowledge that you too, when you're out and about and hiking around, you can identify birds, you can identify plants, and then you can identify your bee and share it with your friends. So I wanted to start off with bees and their cousins. So the cousins, the spectrum of cousins of Hymenoptera. So we have our honeybee. bumblebee, and then these carpenter bees, which are native bees. So if you look at a honeybee, let's look at these two first. So honeybee and a bumblebee. If you look at them side by side, you can see that they're quite different. So they do have that stereotypical like yellow black warning, but if you take a closer look, the honeybee, I would argue, is a little bit more rust, orangish, brownish color, and quite a lot smaller than a bumblebee. So bumblebee is more robust, it's bigger, it's furrier. And so when you look at them side by side, you can see that there's a distinct difference between honeybees and bumblebees. Now let's move over to this side. So carpenter bees, this is the valley carpenter bee, and this is actually the same species. Males are this tawny color. They don't sting. They do bite, but they don't sting. And the valley carpenter bee, female valley carpenter bee. So often folks can get the hang of distinguishing between a honeybee and a bumblebee, but then there might be some confusion between bumblebees and carpenter bees, which are also these really large bees that are out and about. But if we take a closer look, we can see that they have more opaque wings compared to bumblebees. They don't have the yellow pattern, yellow and black pattern, and they are a little bit less hairy and a little bit more shiny and a little bit bigger. That can be hard to distinguish at a moment, but with the coloring and the wings, you can now tell the difference between a bumblebee and a carpenter bee. So this is looking at the different cousins in the spectrum of honeybees, bumblebees, and other native bees. Now let's go into some of the aposematic coloring and the mimicry. So again, we have our bumblebee, and this time we'll start on this side. So folks are quite often familiar with yellow jacket wasps and paper wasps, and you'll see that they have their little thin waists, and these can often look similar. Yellow jacket wasps can be perennial, annual in our area, so they can get become quite large. Their nests can become quite large. I've heard anecdotally for so many people in the peninsula this year that the yellow jacket wasps, and I think so too, the colonies have gotten really big this year, probably because there's a lot of good resources out there for them. Paper wasps, these are the ones that live under the eaves in your house, have the smaller colonies, and sometimes it can be easy to confuse these two. At a glance, there is some difference, but you'll see that they're less hairy than especially bumblebees and honeybees. And then their nesting and their behavior can help you distinguish those two. But these are lumped in the Hymenoptera cousins of wasps. When you compare that to bumblebees, you can see the significant difference where bumblebees are quite much more hairier. All of these share that aposematic coloring where there's like warning coloring. Hey, black and yellow. I can sting. I'm dangerous. Predators, leave me alone. And then over here, we have a hoverfly, or it's also called a flower fly. These are two common names for the same group of syrphids, which are a type of fly. And these ones use that Batesian mimicry instead of the Mullerian mimicry. They use the Batesian mimicry to say like, hey, I'm black and yellow and I'm dangerous, even though they cannot sting, they cannot bite, they cannot sting. So they are using the mimicry of the more dangerous insects and to the predators and saying like, don't bother me. But they're significantly smaller than the rest of these bees. Not hairy. If you took a really close look, which is hard to do, but they only have two wings. And then also their behavior is, if you take a close look and you're out in your garden, you'll see them what they do as their name is they hover, versus bumblebees, wasps, honeybees are a bit more direct when they're going to pollen sources and nectar sources. So that's how you can tell the difference. So that's all to say that, if you're brand new to identifying the flying critters on your on your flowers in your garden, this is a quick way. I'll just flip back to the next one to tell the difference between a honeybee and a bumblebee, bumblebees and carpenter bees, and then bumblebees and their wasps, and then the hoverflies. So hopefully that sets the stage for some of the folks that might be brand new to these yellow and black creatures that are flying around. But why I wanted to talk about bumblebees is because they are actually one of the best insects to start getting insect identification to a species level. It's very common that for entomologists that you have to take insects back to the lab to identify them under a microscope. But with bumblebees, you can do it with your camera at home by yourself. So bumblebees are great to start getting into entomology. So going back to, basic biology of insects, right? We have the 3 body segments and the 6 legs. So the head, right? That's where most of that sensory organs are, the eyes and the antenna and the tongue. We have our thorax that has the appendages for moving, so wings and legs, and it's mostly muscle. But then it's this abdomen that for bumblebees is key for identification. So there's 6 segments on the abdomen, T1 through T6, and they can be one of about 4-ish colors, yellow, black, this rusty, or white. And from this, with bumblebees being so big, they usually have their head stuck in a flower and their abdomen up. You could take a picture and identify a bumblebee. So we'll talk about 3 different bumblebee species, and I'll share some resources with you about how you can identify more. So here again, it's just like one of those quick guides. It's so easy. All bumblebees are Bombus, and then a species name. Bombus is a genus name. So Bifarius, Bimaculata, etc. And these are the segments, and sometimes their thoraces also have different patterns. But you can tell from the bands and then determine which color it is and which species it is. It's actually quite easy once you like get the hang of it. So if you're on the coast side, you're seeing Bombus vansensky. I have guaranteed you seen Bombus vansensky. This one's quite noticeable. It's a yellow-faced bee. Maybe you haven't seen its face, but usually they have that very distinct black body with their 5th segment with that yellow stripe down the back. So it's like yellow, big black thorax, and most of the abdomen with that yellow stripe. You've seen Bombus vansensky, very common on the coastside. Bombus occidentalis, this is one of the ones that we've talked about. That's a species of concern. And if you see this one, oh my gosh, it'd be so great to record it. There are so many citizen or community science organizations out there that are looking for the help of the public to help them identify if there is Bombus occidentalis out there. So this is one to be on the lookout for. This one is distinct by its white butt. Again, it's kind of easy to see once they're staying still, and you can take a picture with your cell phone. There is some variation in some of them species, but the ones around here are this one with this the white segments at the end. Bombus crotchii, again, was one of those rare bees. Probably unlikely you'll see it, but if you do, oh my gosh, that'd be amazing. And you'd notice that by the rusty color that's at the end of its abdomen as well. So now, if you see something that looks a little odd and interesting, to snap a picture and see if it's Bombus crotchii. And I would recommend that you load this information to a citizen science website for scientists to use as we continue to track the status of bees. So what are these resources? For that community or citizen science, Bumble Bee Watch or Bumble Bee Atlas, search for those, and those are great sources. A lot of this information and so much good information comes from the Xerces Society of Invertebrate Conservation. Especially if you're into gardening and you want to know how you can help the bees plant flowers, have good habitat for them. And it's not just about flowers, it's about habitat when they nest in those cavities. So there's a lot of good resources for that. And then, although I've been skeptical about AI, there's an excellent group of entomologists that connected with computer scientists to develop this bee machine AI identification, which again, I was skeptical, but it's actually really good. Great for identifying bumblebees. You upload a really good, as clear of a picture, close-up picture as you can, or a zoomed in picture of a bumblebee. Even some native bees can be identified by this one now too, and it's pretty accurate. So you can also just look for bee machine AI. With that, I say thank you to everybody. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about bees. And next time, when you see these pumpkins out and about during pumpkin season, also please thank a bumblebee. All right. And with that, stop.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sidhu. Super, super comprehensive. We have a bunch of questions. I'm going to get right to them.
That's good.
This is such a hot topic. It's such a span of different things that people have to ask. But one of the questions you talked about 100% pollination. What does 100% pollination mean?
Yes. Okay. If I didn't explain that clearly, yeah. So with the pollen grains going to the ovule and every single ovule getting 100% pollination, right? So there's usually a number depending on the type of crop that it receives the pollen. And how do I explain this? That it needs 100%. So needs to be a particular pollen grain for every ovule. And if pollen grains don't get deposited and absorbed by the flower to form a fruit, it just aborts. So
Okay.
it needs sufficient pollen to be transferred from the male flower to the female flower.
Okay. And to get the ovulation, right? That makes sense. Or yeah. Right. Okay. So how about the lifespan of a bumblebee?
Yes.
I'm sorry, bumblebee queen. Janet.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that will be that annual cycle. So she'll mate so her mom will lay her later in the season, so around this time. And she'll pupate, emerge, she'll go and mate. Then she'll hibernate over the season, and then her colony, if she's a successful queen and finds a cavity to nest, she will nest for a whole year. So it's annual.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about stinging? Is there bumblebees stinging? Is there any way you would talk about kind of comparing different bees and how they relate to that?
Yes. When a bumblebee stings you, it feels like you've been hit by a truck. I know from experience. But the humble bumblebee does not want to sting. It takes so much for them to sting. I collected over nearly 2,000 bees in my studies where I collected them in that tiny vial, and you would understand it. It's like getting upset about being stuck in a vial. And I only got stung twice out of all the bees that I collected. And that was when I accidentally had smushed her head in between like the vial and the thing. And I like released her because I felt bad. And she got mad, tangled in my hair and stung me on the head.
They
But
all sting. Yeah.
but they don't want to sting. They're very like you can get pretty close to a bumblebee. And it hurts a lot, but it's very rare compared to honeybees, which might be a little bit more, and wasps, which can sometimes be aggressive.
Okay. Why are they called carpenter bees? Do you know?
Carpenter bees, so they're nesting in wood. If you have a porch or a deck that has like a softish wood, and especially on the coast side, you might see some holes that are kind of large, and that would be a carpenter bee nest.
Okay. Jane's asking, how much bare dirt should a gardener try to have available for in-ground nests? Go, Jane.
Yeah, I love that question. Yes, so one of the main things I like to stress is like it is great we're planting native flowers for bees, but we need to have that habitat. And as Jane is saying, many bees like to nest in that bare ground. That I would refer you to the Xerces Society where they have the garden guides, but some bare ground is good. Some folks say there's too much mulch in most gardens and you should have some bare ground. But then it's that balance of like you're also trying to do weed control, etc. So if you can spare some bare ground, excellent.
Great. Will honeybees, will bees in general cross a variety of geographical elements? You talked a little bit about the ocean, but they were saying mountain ranges, streams, rivers, etc. Will they cross these types?
So there has been some studies where they released a bumblebee 20 kilometers away from her nest and she found her way back. And so that was like a release and just trying to see. So that indicates that bees can travel quite far. But then they also are limited depending on the species, like to different geographic areas. So you'll have distinct populations. So some of them will get over a mountain range or something and be, but then it's unlikely that those two populations will mix. So there is a limitation because ultimately most bees want to stay within a range of their nest. Yeah.
What about the weight of pollen? Richard's asking, why is some pollen heavier than others? And are there advantages? Like he's talking about the California poppy having a specific weight. So is there any advantage to having a certain weight to the pollen?
That might be more of a botanist question, but yeah, pollen are very different sizes. Yeah, I had another colleague that was studying pollen, and I remember some species like, oh, this is really easy to count how many pollen grains the bee had on its body because they're quite large, and then in other cases they're quite small. The reason I think is just natural variation, but perhaps a botanist may have a better answer for that.
I'll have them set. So if Richard, if you're still here and you're curious about that, if you send us an email here, we can connect you with a great botanist. Tony Corelli would be wonderful, that person to connect. But okay. Steve Reddick is asking, there's a spot on the coastal bluffs nearby where you can see dozens of humblebee burrows in about 200 square feet. That's set. You got to meet Steve. Separate colonies with separate queens, or one big colony linked by underground tunnels. He's saying.
It would probably be a separate colony. So that's amazing, Steve. Thank you for sharing that. I want to know where it is, but we also want to leave those bees alone. So that's
well, he is quite close with a number of us, so we could probably get that information, Steve.
But yeah, this is like they find a colony, they find a cavity, sorry, and then nest in it. They're not like making like chambers like ants or something. So they would be separate. That's so cool.
Okay. Let's see, this person is anonymous, but they said, compared to seeking out the mobile bee colony companies, how common is it that farmers keep their own bees? If so, are there any local, state, or national incentives or support offered to farmers to maintain their own bee colonies?
That's a good question. I feel like farming is different than being an culturalist, right? Those are different skill sets. Farmers can do it. They could have their own beehives. Maybe they have a crew or staff that knows their bees. But like, talking to farmers, like they're business people, they're farmers, they have to manage their land managers. Like there's so many skills. So I don't know of any incentives for like farmers to keep their bees. Yeah, it would be hard. It's a different skill set. That's often why this has developed into like partitioning with like renting bees and stuff. Yeah, there are some incentives that some public and private land owners have about like if you're a beekeeper, you can store your bees on their land. And so sometimes there's that kind of thing about providing pollination services.
Okay, actually, a member of our community does that, or is in kind of a partnership, more of a small scale, but a partnership that way. So Susan is asking, can honey last forever in a jar?
Yes.
How long? Yes. Yep. Okay.
It can. Yeah.
Let's see. And this person, so Richard's asking, why did bees need UV directional marking on plants if they visit the same plants over and over?
To know where to target the plant, right? Like it's just like come here, so for folks that might not know, bees can see a little differently than us, right? So there's actually a flower that you might see that's yellow or white. Actually, from a bee, it has like these runways that's like nectar here, pollen here. I think it's just been an adaptation, right? Because it's like this mutualistic through evolution, like the flower's trying to get the most out of the bee. It's probably just like a runway being like, just get right here. Even though they might, but I think what Richard is suggesting is like they should know, right, and learn, but I think it's just how flowers have evolved.
Let's see. I know we're kind of at the end of time, and we'll see if there's a couple of questions that we can answer quickly. Let's see. Meryl was saying you had talked about resources for this AI, and you were talking about all of that. I mean, you linked the resources at their end. Is there anything else you would add to that specifically?
Yeah, so the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. So Xerces starting with an X. So good. And then just look up Bee Machine AI and it should pop up. But yeah, if there's a way to get resources out to folks after, I'm happy to send those links.
That was so funny how you were looking up the bee and you saw this and you're like, what is this even? We have the right number of wings here. What about, Sandy is asking about volunteer opportunities for Jasper Ridge. And Sandy, we will, why don't I link that in our follow-up email as well? Because I think that's wonderful that you're looking for volunteer opportunities for that. Well, thank you. Let's see, can we do 2 more?
Yeah, sure.
Do bumblebees use burrows in places other than dirt? Being asked.
There are like you can make bumblebee nests like if you take an old coffee tin and you put like some stuffing in it, like they will use any cavity that works. So some bumblebee researchers, they've like played around with that. Some of my colleagues, they've played around with that in their own backyards. So they'll use any cavities, but like their default is kind of underground cavities.
Okay. Jane's asking, do bumblebees escape wildfires by going beyond their normal range when habitat is lost? How well do they mingle or compete with neighboring colonies?
Yeah, since they're central place foragers and they have a nest, if the fire comes through, their nest is lost. It is lost, right? And so that is a concern, just like so many of the animals, birds, small mammals, wood rat nests, right? Like if a fire comes through, their homes are lost. And again, that reproductive's the queen. So if the queen's in the colony, and she dies, like that colony is dead. Like the workers might live a little bit longer, but they're not going to reproduce. So yeah, just like all other small mammals and birds, etc., wildfires would impact bees.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We have a number of questions, and we'll look at those and send a couple of these over afterwards. And if there's anything that we can put in our follow-up email, we will do that as well. But I want to be conscious of your time. Thank you so much for making this time to share all of this with our community.
I'm so delighted that so many people came out to listen about the humble bumblebee. And next time you see a pumpkin, I hope you just think of bumblebees and all the wonderful things they do. So thank you so much for everybody's time. I really appreciate this invitation. Thanks.
And Dr. Sidhu was sharing that I think even your kiddos are going to a pumpkin patch today, correct? So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, we're all connected. Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming out today. We will be sending a follow-up email coming out in the next couple of days here. So just check that out. Share this video. The more people know, there's just so much to hear too. And there's so many misconceptions. So it's wonderful to give people the opportunity by just sharing this with people that you know that might be interested. And of course, as always, if you are able, please consider donating to the Coastside Land Trust or Jasper Ridge as well. There's so much work that is being done for research and for environmental protection, and this is all we're all on the right side. Those of you who are coming here, you're all on the right side of it. So let's help each other out and do our part. And we have a wonderful raptor walk that's coming up in November. So hop online if you want to look at details of that. We will be sending out some emails to remind you of that and give you the connection, the registration. But otherwise, you can hop on right now at coastsidelandtrust.org and check it out. We've got Sequoia Audubon is coming over, and we're going to be breaking up into really small groups where people can go out and take a wave crest raptor ramble. And they have it's a really, really wonderful opportunity. Last year we did it, and even in the rain, we were able to see such a breadth of different raptors in that open space there. So thank you all. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. Get out there, look at those pumpkins. Hope you can see a couple of bees around you as well. And we will look forward to seeing you all very soon. All right. Thank you.